Hi, this is Vanessa Gorman. I'm a class assistant at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and this is the third in a series of videos about learning the meta language of grammar, learning to speak about grammar in English before we try to approach it in Greek. So this video will discuss verbs, of course, and how we talk about verbs, the most complex unit of most languages, certainly the most complex unit in Greek. So we talked about the different parts of speech that are possible, and in this video we're going to just talk about verbs. Again, difficult to define, but let's just say it conveys an action, occurrence, or state of being. It is the one required unit in any Greek sentence. Nothing else has to be there to be an independent unit. But the first division we're going to talk about is the difference between what we call a finite verb and a non-finite verb. So a non-finite verb is an infinitive or a participle. And we're going to deal with infinitives and participles quite a bit later. We're going to deal with finite verbs first. Finite verbs are what we call the conjugated form. So just so you know, infinitives and participles, the infinitive is the to x form of the verb. So it can be complementary, like I like to eat ice cream. Or it can be the substantive, to get out of the house is a pleasure. So it's acting like a noun there. There's all kinds of infinitives, uses for the infinitive, especially in Greek, but we'll get to them later. Participles, likewise, they're what we call verbal adjectives. So like a verb, it has things like tense, but like an adjective, it has number, gender, and case. These are the things in English that students use way too often. The ing form, sometimes the ed form, sometimes. So swimming is my favorite exercise. Swimming is a noun here. It's acting substantively. The watched pot never boils is an adjectival use of watched. Coming into work late, I couldn't find a parking place is an adverbial use. It's a shortcut for a subordinate clause, right? After coming into work late. These we're going to set aside for now. We'll come back to them, talk about them in much greater detail. But meanwhile, just so you understand what we're talking about, what are the infinitives in this passage? To visit and to make. Those are the only infinitives we have in this passage. Okay. What are the participles then? Saying and bearing. In both cases, the participles here are acting as a lazy way to make a subordinate clause. All right, so much more on these later. Right now, we want to conjugate on finite verbs, and finite verbs are conjugated. They have a morphology that is described using person, number, tense, mood, and voice. So we're going to go through what person, number, tense, mood, and voice all mean. Person is how many people are involved in the verb. Is it and who? If I'm talking about me or my group, I or we, right? That's the first person. If it's the second person, it's you, whether singular or plural. And then the third person is anybody else. He, she, it, they. Likewise, number is pretty straightforward. There's either one or there's many. Greek does have a dual for two things, but it's fairly rare and you don't really have to memorize it. So if you look at the English word to be in the present indicative active, so first person is I or we, second person you, third person he, she, it, they, with singular and plural. You'll see paradigms written like this, generally speaking. Okay, so what's the tense? The tense is not just when an action happens, but it's also how the action happens. That is it continuing? Is it repeated often, habitually? Has it finished? Has it finished and had permanent results? So we have different, what we call aspects of an action that are important to associate with different tenses. In Greek, there are 7 tenses. The verb is fairly complex. However, 2 of them are almost never seen. I memorized all the forms when I was a student, and some of them I have never ever seen in 35 years. So literally, memorizing them is a complete waste of time. Two of them are fairly sparse. You see them occasionally. They're also typically very easy to recognize when you see them. And certainly if you're using the tools available, you'll have the morphology, it will identify them, and you won't have any problem. Three of them, and I'm marking these three with the triple asterisks, are very common. And therefore, these are the ones that are worth learning and learning well because it will save you a lot of time in the long run. So one of the three is the present tense. This is one that we use an awful lot, as you might guess. You use it for the simple present, the army marches. You can also use it for what's called the progressive present. The army is marching, so it's in the state of marching. It hasn't completed it. And you can even emphasize the army does march. All of these are in the same form in Greek. Also, it can be used historically as a lazy way of indicating a past event. It's not that common. It's certainly not as common as we do it in English these days. One of the things I really hate, simplifying a language and losing its nuance by throwing everything into a historical present, is just plain sloppy. The tense that comes next is the imperfect, also extremely common. It's used for past tense, but past tense which is incomplete or in progress, or sometimes habitual, mostly incomplete or in progress. So in other words, the was were form. The army was marching. They're not done marching, as opposed to the army has marched, which they've done it and they're in the state of having done it. So this is was or were, or sometimes the simple ed form. The army marched against Caria, meaning they did it over and over again. But in English, if you translate it with was or were, or sometimes with ed, you're pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. Likewise, the aorist tense represents the past tense, but when it's done, when it's simple or completed. So if the army marched in the imperfect tense, it's still going on, or it went on for a while. In the past, in the aorist tense, it means it's done. So he sailed into Ephesus. He's there now. He was sailing into Ephesus in the imperfect would mean he's still in progress, right? So this is simple, completed action in the past. It's by far a very, very, very common tense, especially if you're like me and you read a lot of historians and you read a lot of historical narrative. You can often translate it with the ed or the equivalent like wept. Okay, less common, but you'll see it occasionally, is the perfect tense. Another past tense. We've got lots of past tenses, which is continuing action in the past or action continuing from the past into the present. So you've done something, you're in the state of having done it. And usually you can translate this with have or has, which makes it simpler, right? You have done something, you're in the state of having done it. Pericles has been general for 3 years now. He is in the state of being general. He hasn't finished being general. The Thebans have sacrificed to Athena 7 times. Usually translated have or has. Very straightforward. The pluperfect, you'll almost never see it. It's a past event that took place before another action also in the past. So the expedition was not successful is in the past because the general had neglected to make a sacrifice to Athena. So you're starting in past time and going even further back. Translated had, almost always can translate it as had, and it's extraordinarily rare in Greek. The future tense is more common, and you will see futures. They're very easy to spot as a rule. Action in the future of any kind, translated will or shall. The only odd thing about future is it can also mean something that you intend to do or the purpose, because if it's in the future, it's not necessarily true, right? You might intend to do something. So it's in the future. Tomorrow I will go to the store, but then something might happen so that I don't. So this is used occasionally for intention or purpose, and it doesn't necessarily have any kind of aspect to it. Finally, the other very, 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 very rare form is the future perfect, which acts half as a future, half as a perfect. It's something that's expected to happen sometime in the future. And as a future, you translate it will, and as a perfect, you translate it have. So will have. As of next summer, Pericles will have been dead for 7 years. Okay? So rare it's not worth even thinking about. If you see future perfect, you know how to translate it. That's all that matters. Okay, that's tenses. So the present, the aorist, the imperfect are the important ones, at least for now. We'll get into more later. Mood. Person, number, tense. Now, mood and voice. Mood, Greek has 4 moods, and we are going to concentrate on the first one for quite a while now, and that's the indicative, the plain old normal assertions of fact used in independent clauses for the most part, some subordinate clauses, very, very common. This is all we'll be doing for quite a while. Imperative is for commands, only used in the second and third person. You go do this, or he must go do this. Easy to spot generally, not that big a deal. Subjunctive, we'll get to in a while. It's mostly used in subordinate clauses, and so it's not a problem. It's rarely used in independent clauses, and then it represents something unreal. They call it the unreal mood. So it can be a hortatory, which is let us go home. It's essentially a command in the first person. Or it could be for something that is doubtful or deliberative. Should we go shopping today? Maybe it's going to rain later. It might rain later. You can't say it is going to rain later, right? It might rain later. And then likewise, we have something called the optative, which is mostly used in subordinate clauses, so it's not a problem. Rarely in independent clauses to express a wish, may it not rain, or a potentiality. He wouldn't dare lie to me. These are not things you need to worry about right now. We'll have the indicative ingrained in your head before we get into these moods. Finally, Greek has 3 voices, okay? Active, middle, and passive. The active is what we're going to see first off. I'm going to put off the other 2 for a while. The active is when the subject of the sentence is the agent of the verb, is the one doing the verb. Themistocles won the election. That's what you see most often. The passive, I'm going to skip ahead. The passive is when the subject is the thing upon which the verb is acting. So the election was won by Themistocles. He was killed with a club. As one of my students said, you can tell it's a passive verb if you can add the phrase by vampires to the sentence and it makes sense. So it's the case where what had been the subject, the agent, is usually expressed by a prepositional phrase or the instrument, right? So agent would be Themistocles. He was killed with a club, the instrument. This is something that the Greeks use the dative case for. The Greeks also have something called a middle voice, which is like the active mostly, except there's always some kind of reference back to the person doing it. So the subject is the agent of the verb but acts with some special reference to himself. If Susan exercises, she's doing it for her own benefit. If Cymon pours a libation for his own benefit, it would be in the middle. So you'd have that little nuance in there. Some words have different meaning in active and middle. So there's a verb patho that means I persuade, and in the middle it means I obey. So I've persuaded myself, therefore I'm obeying. So let's look at our passage again. Which are the finite verbs in this passage? Pull out all the other verbs in this passage. Okay, so we've got lots of them, right? They come in many different forms. So now what's the morphology of each one of them? Think about person, number, tense, mood, voice. Well, we're going to assume they're all in the indicative. So happened. Third person singular aorist indicative active. This is how you'll see it abbreviated. This is how you'll see it identified. It is acting as the subject of the sentence. This is the relation that you would use to identify it. Sorry, the subject is this. All right, the subject of the happened, sorry. Came, seized, and imprisoned are all third-person singular aorist indicative actives. You get a lot of aorists in a narrative history, with Tissaphernes as the subject. Went, likewise, with Alcibiades as the subject. These are all things that happened. They're not continuing to happen, right? They're done. They're completed action, therefore they're in the aorist. Ordered. The king is the subject. So that's fine. And then provided and made are third-person plurals. They're not singular because they have a plural subject, Alcibiades and Mentithius. Okay. So that's all straightforward. Now, what about the valency of verbs? Valency is probably not a word you've heard before. It's not a word I knew until fairly recently. Valency means what is necessary to complete the meaning of the verb. The main verb of the independent clause is called the predicative. Most grammar books will use the words transitive, intransitive, and copular. So what do these kinds of verbs mean? Let's talk about these in simple English. A transitive verb, the action is carried across to the receiver. So there's a subject and an object, whether expressed or implied. So the Athenians fought a war. We've got a subject, we have an object. The war was won by them. We've got a subject and object. They're just reversed because it's passive. Sosius obeyed has an object because it doesn't make sense. You don't obey in a vacuum. You have to be obeying something. So the object there is implied, but it's still there. It's got to be there. The verb is not complete without whatever it is he's obeying, right? Intransitive verbs don't need an object. It's essentially a subject but no object. So the army marched. That's complete. We don't need to say anything else to make that make sense. Copular verbs, also called linking verbs, link equivalencies. So they're expressed in the same case. We're talking about the verb to be, the verb to become. Tissaphernes became satrap. Both of those nouns would be in the nominative case because the verb's linking to equivalencies. The agora was full of people. Full would be in the nominative case, this adjective, because it's describing the agora on an equivalent level. Other verbs can function the same way and sneak up on you. People will say it's just to be and become, but in fact, there's a lot of verbs that also work this way to be in kind of a state. So, Chaimon felt ill. In Greek, the word ill would be in the nominative case. Alcibiades was found guilty would be in the nominative case. The Milesians remain courageous would be in the nominative case. Okay, and these nominatives are labeled as subject of the verb and the predicate nominative, the penom, in the dependency syntax. Okay, so that's what penom is. So what is valency? This is where we started a minute ago. Valency are the arguments that a verb needs to have, it requires, in order to complete its meaning. Normally they're labeled subject, object, or penom. They are sometimes assumed rather than expressed, but it has to be there, as opposed to things that don't have to be there, which are called, in technical terms, satellites or adjuncts, usually labeled as adverbs, things that don't have to be there. So what am I talking about? Well, we can have verbs that are zero valent. They have no necessary arguments. There's not very many of these. The one that you always see as an example is it rains, because it doesn't really mean anything. We're just saying rains. So there's nothing needed to complete the meaning of that verb. There are very, very few of these. You can have monovalent verbs. These are essentially the intransitive verbs. Let the games begin, right? Games begin, has a subject, doesn't need an object to make sense. The chariot crashed, doesn't need anything else to make sense. Some impersonal verbs. An impersonal verb typically has as its subject some kind of infinitive. To breathe is necessary. So in this sentence, it is necessary to breathe. The infinitive would be the subject of the impersonal verb, it is necessary, which in Greek would be one verb. So that's monovalent. Bivalent, very common, as you might expect, has two required arguments, the subject and the object usually. The the person performing the action, the agent, and the second element upon whom the action is being performed. So if Themistocles made ships, you've got two necessary arguments. You can't just say made ships, nor can you just say Themistocles made, right? It implies something. It needs some object to complete its meaning. In the passive, the war was begun by Xerxes. The war was begun implies some agent, right? It doesn't just begin on its own. And an element, so it's Xerxes, the object, and the element on which he's acting the war. And again, sometimes impersonal verbs fit this category. It is necessary for kaimon to leave. The subject of that sentence is to leave. It is necessary is all one verb in Greek. I need to make that clear. So to leave is necessary for kaimon. So we'll see these in examples when we get to the Greek. Finally, you can have trivalent verbs. The most typical structure is the Athenians sent Sparta reinforcements. We have a subject, we have a direct object, we have an indirect object. So we would label them as subject and object and object. We don't, in dependency grammar, separate the two kinds of objects. Sometimes they're expressed with prepositions. We can say the Athenians sent reinforcements to Sparta, and it's the same sentence. Pompey fought a war against Mithridates, as opposed to Pompey fought Mithridates in a war, so we can flip it around the other way as well. So these verbs require three arguments. Again, sometimes assumed. I can say Max gives to charities. Max has to give something, right? There's some argument over whether you can have a for argument verb, but the convention is you can only have three. So you can't have more than two objects on one verb, in other words. Now, miscellaneous notes, the same verb may require a different number of arguments depending on how it's being used, right? So Mary runs every day is monovalent. All we need is she runs. There's no implied objects. Mary runs a marathon is bivalent, okay? And then finally, like I say, it can be assumed. Max gives to charities. You've got to give something, right? You can't just give. So it implies some kind of object like money. And as I said, there's much dispute as to whether a verb can have four arguments, such as Darius appointed Tissaphernes as satrap for the Ionians. As satrap is something that we would call a complementary object. You make somebody something. And it's hard to know how that's different exactly from a necessary argument, but my experts and my best expert is Pinkster, Harm Pinkster, says three is all you can have. So that's where we go. So let's talk about the valency of the verbs in here. Look at each one and think about how many objects need to be associated with them. All right, so happened. Happened is monovalent. This happened, right? We have a subject. Came is bivalent. It has a subject and a place to which. You can't come without coming somewhere. So place to which is often an argument of a verb. Sometimes place, if you leave, then you have to leave from somewhere, right? Went, again, is bivalent. So in this case, we have an implied object. Seized, we have a subject and an object. Tissaphernes seized him. Tissaphernes imprisoned him. Ordered, you order someone to do something. So it's got three necessary arguments. One of the arguments is the infinitive, right? So that infinitive in Greek would be labeled as the object of the verb because it's what is being ordered. It's a necessary argument of the verb. Provided, also, someone provides something to someone. Made, you make something. That's simple, two elements. Had been taken. Well, that depends on what verb is being used. And do you assume that there's an agent involved with this or not? I mean, that's the real question. Is there an agent? So that's something you'd have to look up and think about. And this is why I like to peruse dictionaries. Now, if you want to learn more about dependency syntax, granted it's all about Latin, but the explanations are very, very clear in Harm Pinkster's Oxford Latin Syntax. And we're all hoping he lives long enough to get volume 2 out because this is just a fantastic reference work.